Welcome to the first of our new Xenia series of travel, tourism, pilgrimage, anthropology seminars. This will be replacing what had formerly been the monthly ATTP seminar. This is being recorded, and so as soon as we start, what I'd like you all to do is please mute yourselves so that way we can focus on the audio coming from the presenter today. After the presentation, there will be time for questions and answers, of course, and this is recorded. If you have any issues with your question being recorded or not wanting to, please send me a note about that and we'll edit it before publishing this to the others that were not able to attend today. In the past, we've had these seminars as part of a SOAS cohort, but this is not a SOAS activity. This is not a SOAS sanctioned or funded activity. This is something independent that some of us from the SOAS community and more importantly from the wider anthropology of travel, tourism, pilgrimage community are putting together. We aim to have one of these on the third Thursday of every month. And then in January or February of this year, we'll be having a full day conference where details will be sent to you prior to that. And we look forward to any of you wanting to present on any topics that are relevant for this. Thank you very much for the people that did donate some funds to this. That was very kind. That helps us keep everything running in the back of the house, as we're an independent organization now. That is certainly much appreciated, so thank you. So without any further hesitation, I'm going to pass this over to Professor Selwyn, who will do the introductions of our speaker today. And Professor Selwyn, as you all know, is the lighthouse, the beacon, the originator of this field, although he will deny that and deny his involvement in that, perhaps. If it wasn't for Professor Selwyn, none of us would be here today in this capacity, that's for sure. If there's one person in the world that I know that has connected more people to other people, it's Professor Selwyn. So keeping on that connection here, Professor Selwyn, please. And you can unmute yourself too.
What we could do is we could just use our first names rather than our family names, or any what do they call them? You know, when you have to put your Mr. or Mrs. or Miss or something. Anyway, so you get the point. Jeff, thank you very much for this really strong movement towards a very interesting series that we're going to have. And I'm extremely happy, more than happy, to introduce Safet, HadžiMuhamedović, whose book, Waiting for Elijah, is the first book in a series that we run for Berghahn Publishers. We now have 3 books and are looking for quite a lot of others, but Waiting for Elijah is the first one. And it does pose the question, which we will ask Safet later on, about the extent to which we should look backwards towards our patriarchs and matriarchs for inspiration. Because I think it's all very well Christians and Jews and Muslims saying that they have, we say that we have these patriarchs and matriarchs. But what does it actually mean? Do we just have them as residents or sites that we pass through and tick off, or do we actually pay any attention to them? Anyway, Safet will deal with that. It's difficult to know what to say about Safet, except that he is, in my view, one of the most brilliant young anthropologists that we are fortunate to have in Europe, and whose work is of exceptional importance at a time when the only thing we seem able to do is to talk about something called security something called safety, and to regard these terms as being synonymous with the putting up of walls or the exchange of arms or the making of deals between countries that really have an interest in selling arms and killing people and ethnically cleansing parts of the world. And in that sense, Safet's book both is present and future, and as I said before about the reference to Elijah, it's also past, so it's past, present and future all together. I think that's about enough really from me, and we all look forward hugely to hear Safet talk about things that he's going to talk about. Safet.
Tom, I told Jeff before, when he told me that you would introduce me, that I knew that you would be kind. And this was very kind. And thank you so much for this beautiful introduction. I'll transcribe it later on and put it on my wall. It comes, I'm particularly glad because it comes from you. As an ally, I think no research whatsoever is non-political. Everything is political. And as soon as we recognize that our research is political, then we can have some kind of orientation and the kind of alliance that sort of under the umbrella of your work on home and belonging and migration, the kind of alliance that you created for the anthropology of travel, tourism, and pilgrimage group means so much. And it means so much in terms of my career. As you know, as you mentioned, my book was published in your series, but more than that, I've joined with you and Jeff and a few others this teaching group in SOAS, and we continue to organize various things. And then the Xenia series is one of these new adventures. And as all of you know, and I recognize most of the names today, what happens particularly with Tom is that once you get in touch with whether it's the summer school or the MA or one of the conference panels, you come into the fold of this family, and we very soon start communicating. And I already feel that that's what we're doing. I mean, I certainly know for most of you who are in the chat room today what you are doing in terms of your research, and I know that we will be doing some things together as well. Now, if somebody hasn't met me, and I think there are perhaps a couple of people, I'm primarily an anthropologist of landscape and religion. Most of my sort of long-term fieldwork, as anthropologists like to say, was conducted in southeastern Bosnia, in the Dinaric highlands. And this is what I'll be talking about today as well. And this is what my book was about. It was about temporality in an eviscerated landscape or ethnically cleansed landscape. But you'll see more about that in a second. I currently work for the Cambridge Interfaith Program, which is based in the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge. I also do a little bit of teaching still for the summer school with Tom and Jeff and Linda and Reza and Xenia at SOAS. Let me try to share my screen now. I think this should be it. Let me see. So now let me also see whether I can toggle this. Okay, so it looks good now. Can you just let me know if you see the screen? Perfect. How do I move this along? Okay, so this is the book that Tom mentioned, Waiting for Elijah, that came out in Tom's series. This is an edited collection with a colleague of mine, Maria Grujic, in which Tom also published. And these are sort of the two publications that perhaps give some indication of my work and what I'll be talking about today. But I want to start from, and this is an image from this year's summer school in anthropology of travel, tourism, and pilgrimage, and it sort of looks a little bit like us today as well in this chat room. And I want us to sort of to look at us, and think about how we're getting used to this extension of our bodies into the virtual space, and finding new ways of social touch to regain some sense of normality. And we are rapidly conquering these new technologies. Well, for some they are new, for some they are not so new, but we are conquering them and redesigning notions of communications and community, home, and the everyday. At least that's the idea. That's what we are sort of trying to grapple with. Now, a few months ago, it all seemed much more disorienting, and we were locked down, separated from the people, places, activities which populate our lives, almost as if the tectonic plates of our habitual worlds shifted and left us to reconstitute the pieces of our sort of habitual world in completely new circumstances. Now, the habitual, this is a concept that particularly phenomenologists have focused on, and Sara Ahmed, sort of a philosopher, feminist philosopher, also a phenomenologist, she noted, and she focused on the habitual, she noted that habitual is not readily perceived, yet through its enactment, things become part of the self, so that, in her words, habits do not just involve the repetition of tending toward something or someone, but also involve the incorporation of that which is tended toward into the body. So incorporation into one's own body. And these objects that we tend toward extend our own bodies by extending what we can reach. And in Ahmed's words, reachability is an effect of the habitual, in the sense that what is reachable depends on what our bodies take in as objects that extend their bodily motility, the possibility of movement, and they become like a second skin, these objects that are sort of reachable, that are part of our habitual. So habits exert a hold over us. They propel us towards certain actions, construct our dispositions of different kinds. Yet, habitual moments are not something we usually approach analytically. It's something we just do. And Maurice Merleau-Ponty, another, well, a French now phenomenologist, noticed that in the cultivation of habits, it is our bodies that understand. It is our bodies that understand rather than sort of having this cognitive process about something. And so when we are oriented, we might not notice that we are oriented. Our bodies sort of do the work. So if the habitual, as Sara Ahmed proposes, is like a second skin, the question is, when do we notice the orientations of our skin? One's skin attains presence when it dramatically changes, when it is alienated, when another kind of skin is contrasted against it, when it suffers and enjoys. Its taken for grantedness is disturbed in unusually intemperate climates, and so on. A shift in our habitual space-time relations, likewise, awakens the recognition of our body's reachability, this habitual thing. And sometimes it turns the habitual into desire. So the coronavirus may expose the meaning of coffee shared face-to-face with a friend. Exile and return may beckon the intimacy of home. An empty landscape might emphasize the communal bonds of a seasonal feast when the landscape was not empty. So these moments, and again, to turn to fantastic Sara Ahmed, she called these turning points of various intensity moments of disorientation. And she said, these moments of disorientation, they're bodily experiences that throw the world up or throw the body from the ground, from its ground. Yet in these moments of disorientation, we also start to register in a new way what is habitual, what is familiar. And so we become suddenly, oftentimes unwantedly, we become conscious of what constitutes home, what constitutes that habitual, what constitutes the reachability of one's body, and who constitutes what's reachable. And the spatial and temporal coordinates of our lives in these moments of disorientation, they're laid bare. And we are in a position to think about that stuff that we usually just do, that we don't have to, or we don't usually spend time thinking about the structures of our habitual lives. So if the coronavirus lockdown throws our routine worlds into a crisis, we should remember that others not only continue to live with various forms of lockdown generated by war, poverty, disabilities, visa restrictions, other diseases, but also that these types of isolation and fear intersect with the current pandemic. So the coronavirus is certainly not the great equalizer, as Madonna so kindly informed us from her bathtub. And I gave here an image of Yemen, which we know where the intersection of immense poverty, famine, war, or aggression by Saudi Arabia, and coronavirus is producing hell for people who live in Yemen. But I could have also, and we just spoke to Christiane, I could have also mentioned Palestine and the lockdown of Palestine and its inhabitants, the occupation, which is another kind of lockdown which intersects currently with the pandemic. And so it's not the great equalizer. Let's forget about that suggestion. Although, as I mentioned in the summary for this talk, I think that this sort of isolation that we are facing in different ways, it does give us an opportunity to think about the isolation of others, historical isolation, current isolation, other forms of isolation, and intersections of isolation in different ways. So that's kind of what I want to mention. I want to focus on a particular landscape, which is a landscape that I've looked at as part of my field work in Bosnia, and it started as part of my doctoral field work actually quite some time ago now in 2012. This is, you can see on the map of Bosnia, this sort of circled area of Gatsko, and on the border, or in the southeast, on the border with Montenegro. And I focused on a very sort of wide karst field called the Field of Gatsko, which is a very interesting space, but which sort of underwent in the 90s the violent nationalist campaigns of ethnic cleansing, much like most other landscapes in Bosnia. And those, in this landscape, those who were deemed unfitting to the ethno-national religious fabric were killed and expelled, and entire towns and villages were turned to ashes. One particular landscape is Gatsko, but I could have just as easily today talked about any of the other landscapes that I did some research on, or landscapes where I lived. I was born in Bosnia, north part. It's not marked here on the map, in a town called Brčko. I lived much of my life in Sarajevo, which is the capital. So in Gatsko, in southeastern Bosnia, only a handful of non-Serbs who were expelled from this landscape have returned in the late 1990s. And most of those who returned were elderly people who decided to return despite the constant intimidations and lack of provisions for basic life. Now, this is a snippet of a conversation that I had with a woman who returned to her home, another small town in Bosnia, and she recounted this to me, not as something special, but it was part of a longer conversation. The last time I saw her, shortly before she passed away, I was sitting in the house one evening, alone. What to do? I can't watch the TV anymore. I pick up the phone and dial a random number. A woman answers. Hello, hello. What are you doing? Nothing, watching TV. So we start talking. She is alone too. And we agreed to meet. She was here the other day for lunch. Now, for me, this conversation painted a picture of destroyed landscapes in which people who return are desperately searching for social anchors, attempting to locate strategies against loneliness. The returnees in Gatsko, in that field that I mentioned, lived under lockdown in their villages. The town of Gatsko, which is sort of in the middle of this wide karst field, was completely ethnically cleansed and remained so when I was doing my research there. And it was saturated with symbols of new power relations, new temples in places where the old ones were destroyed, statues of new political figures, graffiti celebrating war criminals, as the one you see on the left, celebrating Ratko Mladic as the big Serb hero. And so on. And the returnees who I spoke to were even afraid to walk through the town. The first time, or the first year when they just returned and they needed to pass through the town, you know, in their cars or buses, the stones would be thrown at the buses and so on. So they're still afraid of going into town for the most part. Although the situation is slightly changing, some things are being rebuilt there, but still people are not living in the town. They're living in these enclaves, villages around the returnees. So to endure such a disorienting violence, these returned refugees, the returnees, they constructed two opposing temporally specific landscapes, the homely past and an unhomely present. From the past, only defining moments of social touch were selectively nurtured. So it was an idealized landscape in which they lived, this landscape of the past. Now, what is this landscape? You know, selectively narrated, selectively lived. It is a landscape which sounds like some kind of golden age of interfaith, shared spaces, a landscape in which Orthodox Christians, Muslims, and Gurbeti Roma live together. They celebrate certain feasts together. Muslims and Christians enter into spiritual kinship called kumstvo with each other. This is very similar to this concept of Xenia that it gives the title to our series. It is a particular kind of relation that it's usually formed between two people, but once two people, and it was always two people of different faiths in this landscape. So Christians and Muslims, once two people enter, then their households, sometimes for longer than a century, they keep this bond, which they say is more important than blood relations. And they take care of each other, provide shelter to each other, and so on. Also, they engaged in various forms of work together, and all of these kinds of histories of shared lives in this landscape are created into a narrative that is juxtaposed to the present, where the Christians and the Muslims cannot live together, where the other community needs to be erased in order for one to live and to survive. And it's juxtaposed to these warnings, these memorials that one constantly sees when in Gatsko, and the speeches that the church clergy gives about providing warnings for the future of the threat of living with Muslims and so on. The central, most important day of this narrative is Saint Elijah's Day. Now, Saint Elijah is a very interesting figure. In Bosnia, it's a figure that is celebrated by Muslims and Christians of different denominations. Also very closely tied to the Slavic sort of pre-Christian deity of thunder, Perun, which is sort of the counterpart of the Greek Zeus, or sort of Scandinavian Thor, and so on. But according to Julian calendar, on the 2nd of August, every year, Saint Elijah's feast as a harvest feast would be organized. Now, Christian villages would organize feasts around the church. Muslim villages would organize around the mosque, but they would also sort of intermingle, and they had sort of knowledge about these shared or the same activities. Very often they would mix, because the Christian gathering would be in the morning, the Muslim one would start around noon. This grew into the lexicon of the landscape, this sort of shared space, both difference and sameness, both sharing and sort of difference at the same time. Not difference, at, sameness at the expense of difference, this homogenization. So Elijah's Day was a condensed image, or it was presented as a condensed image of the field as home. The most familiar spatio-temporal site, 2nd of August in the field, when everybody would gather, when there was drink, food, dance, singing, marriages were arranged, and so on and so on. So it was the most joyous festive occasion you can imagine. It was needed because very soon afterwards, this landscape would be locked into snow, and it would be basically communication would be prohibited by the snow. It was really a lockdown. And even when I was there, people would use skis to get, from one house to another. And a helicopter crashed into this landscape trying to bring supplies to the villagers. It's very dramatic. So you have to stay in your household during the winter, and you dream and you wait for Elijah's Day. On the 2nd of August, you prepare the whole year. After the war, after this cleansing, Elijah's Day became the only day in the year when the diasporas, when all of these people who were in exile, who lived, in North America, Croatia, West Europe, and so on, they would come back. They would spend one day there, and the field suddenly resembled itself. So the returnees, those few, mostly elderly people who returned, they would wait for Saint Elijah, but it was a different kind of waiting. Not the traditional kind of waiting, but they added to the traditional kind of waiting and that excitement, this post-war meaning. They waited to wait the way they once waited. They waited to wait the way they once used to for that landscape. So that waiting for Elijah had significant political qualities. Now this is Delva, a post-war returnee to the village of Kula that's in the field of Gatsko. She would come back to her house only during the warm months, from spring until early autumn, and stayed with her children in the city of Mostar during the winter, because really there was no provision in these villages for basic life. Her hope of return was only ever short-term, to come back the next spring. And I came to know this most effectively when I helped her paint the walls of her kitchen. Next to her dwelling room, the kitchen looked exposed, unhomely. She gave me her son's old shirt so that I didn't soil mine with paint. When we were done, she cooked chicken for us and we watched television together. Much later, I noticed on this photograph the apron that she was wearing that day when we were painting the kitchen. Adorned with red apples and white flowers, it said, "Home, sweet home," in English. And I still wonder how ontologically removed from the field this image on her apron is, and whether we can ever allow ourselves to speak of home as such. Now, when Safet, who you see here on the right-hand side, she's Delva's neighbor, when she saw me taking on this limited recuperative project, I offered the same favor to her, to paint her kitchen, which she very happily accepted. I never got to paint Safet's kitchen because I was leaving for another fieldwork location. It was multi-sited fieldwork on the morning when the day before I was supposed to do it. Looking back at these moments, they seem to have gained in importance. Both Safeta's and Delva's restored kitchens, the warming hearths of their homes, stood for their hopes of return. In the field of Gatsko, these spaces can also be said to be an emblem of relatedness, the kitchen, and also the women's role in maintaining and creating relatedness in the field of Gatsko. So the intervention, painting the kitchen, maintaining this kitchen, also seemed to make a political point about the community. This was not a bold, uttered hope, but a reserved and solemn one, which was performed through this small restorative task. This land, and the land itself, it was perceived as lonely. It was unattended, desocialized, confined, and withdrawn. Here was a path towards the old tombstones on the mountain, people would tell me, but it was overgrown by brambles. Or they would say, Gurbeti Roma used to camp there each spring, where those brambles are now. If the weeds, korov, signified an unhomely house, these shrubs, these brambles called trnje or thorns, were the image of an unhomely landscape. The land was also silent. It ceased to communicate through miraculous phenomena. It no longer yielded fairies, ghosts, or other figures with a divine connection to it. Now, here you see in this image Bekir and Zahida on their land. They are the oldest returnees to the field of Gatsko. And I had lots of conversations with them, particularly with Zahida, who is the most fantastic storyteller about cosmologies and the landscape and so on. And in this snippet of a conversation that I'm actually not going to read out now, they were speaking about St. George's Day on the 6th of May and the celebrations which they, as Muslims in this landscape, attended with Gurbeti Roma. Now for Roma, St. George's Day is the biggest holiday. And it's a very big one for Orthodox Christians, Catholic Christians, and Muslims in Bosnia as well. But for Roma people, it's the biggest occasion. And so when they recounted this, the grammatical tense shifted between past and present. And for moments, they seemed to sort of transpose their bodies into this landscape. And when they recounted this dance around the fire, the ritual dance around the fire, the celebrations, the names of their Gurbeti Roma people. By the way, there were no Roma people in Gatsko when I did research there. No Roma people have returned. But when they recounted it, it was alive. And it suddenly awakened these landscapes for me. I saw these landscapes before. I saw the spaces where they said Gurbeti Roma lived, and I saw emptiness. And suddenly, these spaces that were apparently empty, they were not empty, they were eviscerated. They were emptied. I could hear the laughter of Zahida and Bekir sort of echoing through this space. I knew that there was a particular kind of sociality that was disembedded from these landscapes. So late winter gave way to spring, then rolled into grassy summer, and these seasons are very dramatic in the field of Gatsko. But when I was there without song, as if time was fathomable beyond one's body, detached, the muteness stood violently over the valley. It was no longer an empty but eviscerated space, as I said. The inaudibility was different from the one I heard before these narratives of my interlocutors, and before their memoryscapes inhabited kind of how I approached the landscape. And both the landscape and the humans in such a post-social world were lonely, unattended, waiting for the return of the known habitual relations. So one strategy of dealing with loneliness was a life in the past of the landscape, filled with desired social relations. Given the absence of a younger generation, the transfer of memory had shifted from public performance, from these feasts and rituals and so on, to intimate narratives. And bodily immersion in a past landscape lingered like a phantom limb. Its sensations were relived with the excitement and texture of immediacy, before regressing into an acknowledgement of loss. And in these narratives of my interlocutors, I was offered in their daydreaming a landscape rich in encounters between people of different faiths, encounters with magical beings like nymphs and fairies and ghosts and apparitions of all kinds, encounters with animals, bodies of water, trees and herbs, a landscape of gatherings and festivities. And it was only when I returned from fieldwork to London and I started to transcribe all these interviews, many of them were recorded or my notes, and I noticed the endings of my conversations. It was very striking because all of, or most of the endings were certain kinds of regressions. And I give you here a few examples. What can you do? Where there used to be 700 households, now there are 30 souls, all old like me. There, that's how it was. There was beauty. There really was. There were many things, but there you go. But now, by God, none of that exists. The villages have died out, almost completely, died out. Ah, they were beautiful traditions. Now it has all dissipated. Nobody practices them anymore. There is no life, not here. It won't. There is no life. By God, there was lots of stuff before, my son, and today it cannot be. They've taken all of this. Today, nothing can be as it was before. They are no more. There are no more fairies, no good ones, saintly figures. There's nobody to see utvare, these ghostly apparitions in the landscape, nor to experience nur, the supernatural light from the graves of saints. Now, these and hundreds of similar temporal adjustments were how long narratives of how it used to be usually ended. The present committed repetitive acts of violence upon the effectively returning landscape. All the endings were moments of disenchantment. In them, the field of magic beings, of goodness, of saints had disappeared. And the general tenor of narration would take a sharp turn from rich and vibrant descriptions like those of Becin and Zahida, the visceral and tactile reconstructions of their landscape in the past, often laughter, towards brief, fractured, and sober realizations of an explicit loss and the usual moment of silence or puff on the cigarette, sip on a cup of coffee. Elaine Scarry has argued that physical pain might resist language, but also simultaneously shatter it by deconstructing it into the pre-language of cries and groans. The awakening silence following narratives in Gatsko is a shattered language or a post-language, a bodily arrest at the overwhelmingly unnarratable, perhaps echoing Adorno's words about the impossibility of post-Holocaust poetry, an inexpressibility marking the point where two time spaces meet each other, the landscape of the past and the landscape of the present. Now, Maurice Holbach's, perhaps by way of his own dealings with the war, described the root of dreamlike states or contemplative memory, a passage encountered by the Gatsko returnees as well. Such a past may offer a way out of the present and is thus never free from it. So in his words, if we flee in this way from the society of the people of today, this is in order to find ourselves among other human beings and in another human milieu, since our past is inhabited by the figures of those we used to know. In this sense, one can escape from a society only by opposing it to another society. So these escapes to the past, such as the ones I experienced in grad school with the returnees, in Holbach's argument with regards to the elderly, he argued, they are dream-like states, even yearnings, formed by societal pressures in contrast to the present. They appear, Holbach argues, as moments of relaxation, these retreats into the past. And so, such episodes of temporal retreat may be understood as a coping mechanism and the longing for home. So home then appears as a residual past of the body that resonates through another time space. It is a lingering protrusion into the scapes of its own loss. Its phantom existence demands something from the body and through the body, as these landscapes are alive. Now, phantom limb, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, another French phenomenologist, noted phantom limbs often preserve and perpetuate the exact position they occupied at the time of injury. So a phantom arm occupies the position that it occupied when the arm was actually there. So the arm is not really lost because the body does not cease to allow for the arm, for that phantom limb. And landscapes of home, the complex of human, non-human interventions upon the body, they make possible the interpenetrative forms of the world and the self. So these landscapes of home are both the growth of the body within and this part of the world, and the growth of the world within and this part of the body. So when elements or parts of this attachment of the world and the body are severed, and particularly if the split is sudden and unwanted, as it was in grad school with the war, what remains of the body, from that severed connection between the landscape and the body, what remains carries in itself the presence of what is lost. And this is that kind of experience. These are the narratives. They're of kind of a phantom landscape. So what Merleau-Ponty noted about the phantom arm, we could say is true for the grad school home as well. Namely, to have a phantom landscape is to remain open to all the actions of which the landscape alone is capable. So by preserving that landscape, some would say it's dead, it's in the past, but these returnees, they live in that landscape. They preserve it and they keep it alive so that they keep the possibility of its revival. It's not true in the present, but it may be a true for the future. And so it's a sort of a coping mechanism, and I would say it has significant political qualities. So if there were to be an anthropology of solitude and loneliness, I think it would have to be an anthropology of communication. We would have to dive into the worlds of connections, longed for or rejected. We would have to look into what people are struggling to regain or discard. We would have to trace the spatial and the temporal qualities of solitude and loneliness and the techniques of coping with them. Even when to be alone is a matter of choice, it is one predicated on the condition of relationships. And of course, the lines between voluntary and involuntary solitude, much like those between voluntary and involuntary displacement, may sometimes be blurry. Many solitary people in Gatsko did not have to return to the field of Gatsko. They didn't have to return. They could have lived with their children in exile. They could have lived with diasporic communities. But yet the condition of being alone is not simply about the lack of social networks, as some of the studies of urban loneliness and solitude inform us. You can be amongst people and still be lonely. You can be in a city of 20 million people and be lonely, because loneliness, as we see in Gatsko, it's about a particular kind of a particular network of connections. And so to be with people in another place, one could still be lonely, as refugees in other places may still be lonely, because this kind of social network is not there. And so this kind of return is not a choice between loneliness and sociality, even if one can choose between being in a place with people and being solitary. One is always in the midst of others, thrown into the consequences of their presence, or, as in Gatsko, absence. But these are not just any others whom we want or do not want to be with. These others are constituted in us, filtered through our being in the world with or without them. So if disconnection from others is solitude, loneliness is disconnection within a desire for connection. And loneliness depends really on some image of an integrated whole, whether it's a family, a neighborhood, a friendship, a home. And so loneliness is a nostalgia for home, a yearning for home, is a need for a former sociality, for those others who constituted our landscape, and for the intimacy and security that such relationships provided. And in Gatsko, they're narrated in these sort of ways that very much contradict with nationalist purification of home, because these connections were crossing these kind of faith boundaries that were established with the rise of nationalism in the late 80s and the 90s. Now, this is what in the 80s Perlman and Peplau called the discrepancy perspective in the social psychology of loneliness. Loneliness, they argued, is a discrepancy between one's desired and achieved levels of social interaction. It is not constituted simply through the absence of social contact, but through the desires, expectations, and needs of what social contact ought to be. And in the field, loneliness is the discrepancy between the present and the past of the landscape, because what the expectations of those social networks are lies in the past, or the expectations are modeled upon those past relations. And it's loneliness on a large scale in Gatsko. It's a need, a desire for social networks that were systematically unraveled in the 90s. Let me just see very quickly. I'm over time. I know we started a bit later. So I will sort of very briefly go through this interesting example and then make my conclusion with apologies for being a bit over time. This is an Indian soap opera, a telenovela called Balika Wadu, which was very popular with these solitary people in Gatsko. In very sort of different parts of the field, they were watching this telenovela, which in Bosnian, it was translated as Mlada nevjesta, which means the young bride or the little bride. Apparently, the more correct translation from Hindi would be the child bride, strong relationships of a tender age. A long story short, a young girl is married. She's a low caste young girl. She's married to a higher caste, equally young boy. And she joins this sort of large family where there are other brides. She is the youngest, and there's a very strong-willed, wise, but somewhat cruel matriarch, the mother-in-law who you see in the center. And it's all about these dynamics between this young bride, the matriarch, and this kinship network. Now, what I recognized for these people who were sort of solitary and watching religiously, sometimes 2 times with reruns per day, these women in the field, they were watching this Indian telenovela. But then when I started to listen to their bridal stories, I noticed the similarities. The young bride who comes into, sometimes, one of 7 brides who comes into the house, and has to do all the work and is not appreciated by the mother-in-law and so on. This telenovela for them reconstituted a piece of their home. And it was quite uncanny to see, how they sort of delved into this and then created these parallels, really. So it was a form, and I'm not really just stating the obvious that television is a symptom of modernity and that it often comforts us in our times of loneliness. But more than that, that this particular show, more than any other that was on television at the time, for them created that connection, that bridge to a landscape, a sociality that was violently removed from that landscape. And so they rekindled their home in a way. Now, loneliness seems to homogenize time, and it begs a return to the point before a significant rupture in the social fabric had occurred. And there are probably many different kinds of loneliness in the field of Gatsko, just like anywhere else. But although it sounds really like a paradox, the loneliness in Gatsko does appear to be collective. It's a sort of chronic collective loneliness formed through very similar absences, infringing upon collective webs of meaning. And so people are dealing with solitude and loneliness in strikingly similar ways. This is a poem that sort of paints the picture a little bit by Liesl Müller, but there will be a recording, and perhaps the poem is titled Scenic Route, and perhaps you can access it later on or access the recording. And I will sort of move towards a conclusion about these phantom landscapes of the field, which are textured, lively, abundant, and actively negotiating the unwanted presence. And making these temporal transpositions, they seemed unwilling to forfeit their claim over the land, their claim over the body. So the returnees were carefully threading through sort of the present, fear, and hope, creating this sort of hybrid way of being, sort of, transposing into the past, which is homely, and then rupturing into this unhomely present, sometimes daring to think about the future, some more than others, and so on, but being very attuned to any sign of hope for the future and the reconstruction of their landscape. So what are we in the end to make of loneliness? I suggest that we should see it as a powerful depiction of social orientations, which is where we started with Sarah Ahmed. Loneliness expresses not only our understanding of the bodily connections lost, but also a desire for a particular kind of society, which may sometimes have significant political implications, as in the field of Gatsko. And the social isolation in Bosnia, I would argue, is a political violence on the scale of the body. Now, I have given you a short glimpse into Southeastern Bosnian people's strategies of return and strategies against loneliness. I would sort of urge you to think about the kinds of disconnections that we are experiencing in different ways right now, and perhaps try to relate to ethnographies of loneliness and maybe some of these words through that, although many of you might have other experiences to build upon. Thank you so much. Apologies again for being over time. And thank you so much for listening to this rather long presentation.
Safet, thank you so much. That was inspiring. What a complicated yet simplistic way to look at these things. I look forward to rewatching this and trying to unravel each of the points over the next 10 years of my life. What a wonderful, this idea of when you said something is not true in the present, but maybe true in the future. That was such beautiful wording, and something that we can all really relate to now, not just in our research, but certainly in our personal lives. And that is such words of hope, and something that in all of our diversity throughout the world that connects us all now, is that something may be true in the future. And that was really just so beautiful. So thank you for kicking off that series. What I would suggest is that I'll send out with the recording link to people also the still of the poem as well. I see that Tom is very eager to ask a question. And so we'll start with him and then have about 30 minutes of questions and answers through here. If there's anything, anyone would like to ask a question, please note it, let me know in the chat, and then I'll moderate and call in those questions as we go. So Tom, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Safet. It's not so much a question for Safet, but more of a comment for everybody. Noting that before Jeff started, before Safet started, Jeff made something about counting the number of countries that we all came from. And then when Safet started, he started with a picture of us all during the most recent summer school in July. And actually placed his whole talk really on the connections and associations between us as a group and the work that he was talking about, and also said a couple of times, or at least twice or thrice, that of course his talk and his brilliant, absolutely brilliant evocation of the field of Gatsko, unbelievably moving, was political. And of course it was highly political, ideological, and so on. And so the comment that I wanted to make, and that's, I don't really want to say anything after that at all, is to invite everybody else in our group that we have now, which builds on the group that we did have in the summer. What other examples, what other references, what other memories can we, stroke you, have or draw up about the relations that Safet has invited us to think about, namely the self in the other, the lonely in the communal, the past in the present, and the present in the future. How can we, us, bring our own insights and memories and thoughts into this discussion? So that would be my question to everybody. And anybody can start who would like to.
Thanks, Tom. I think that that's certainly, wow, that is as expected. Our first question coming from that is from Dennis, actually, and then Christian after Dennis.
Well, thank you, Jeff. And I've got to say that when Jeff invited me to participate in this, I thought I would be by far the least qualified to participate, and that's correct. Having listened, it has been extremely enlightening and eye-opening for me, in that I have no background in anthropology. I stick with military history of World War II and the Cold War. So many things you spoke about were absolutely fascinating, and it's just the tip of the iceberg for me. What I'm wondering is, I would like to self-educate myself on, anthropology and, specifically possibly World War II and the Cold War and the effect on people during and thereafter. And I was just going to ask that if in the next months anyone might help me educate myself, I would be ever so grateful, because this has been just an opening of a door for me. So, Safet, thank you so much. And I just hope that possibly in the future I can be in touch with some of you to open the door a little wider, shall we say. So thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Dennis. I have some thoughts on that of how we can help you there, but I would like to say that no one is unqualified who approaches these questions. If there's one thing about anthropology, it's the universality of this. And with the increase of importance of autoethnography and the field of anthropology of travel, tourism, pilgrimage specifically opening itself up to other disciplines and to other experiences, we find that this is an area that continually grows. And as Safet said at the beginning, through Tom and through this network, we find ourselves looking at different experiences and finding different answers and asking different questions than we perhaps would have anticipated before. So thank you for that. And next summer, when we do our summer program, I encourage you to join in on that as well. Great. Christiane, you had a question and you wanted to invite some feedback after your question, I believe.
I'm not sure it's a question. It's just a bit of a couple of comments, and I would really appreciate some return on these comments. First of all, this idea of memory and going back to the past and the nostalgia, etc., is always, I mean, there's like a filter, which means that when we remember the past, we always tend to embellish it. So whatever Safet described is very much something that the Palestinians experienced in 1948, in 1967, and even today, they are still experiencing it. And when you talk about the past to old people, they will use exactly the same terms and the same nostalgia for a bucolic past. Although life was hard, and if they were farmers, they really had a hard life, getting up at dawn and working the land and tilling the land until the evening. But still, there's this kind of filter in their mind about the past. And if you also look at people now, today, getting older, they also tend to look at the past when they were younger. Also, they would tend to embellish it and look at it as a happy time, or at least a happier time. And if you want to compare this with what's happening today with COVID, you will notice that we already are starting to think of our normal life as something to look forward, to look back to, as if it's part of a past. And the uncertainty of what's going to happen in the next few months makes us feel like we are going through a different kind of lifetime, a different kind of phase, and as if there's this rupture of life before COVID and now. Except that with today, the nostalgia is different. I would like to go to a cafe, and I would like to go to the cinema, and I want to go shopping, and I want to go to the library, or it's mostly a desire and a longing for things that are mostly consumption. You know, so I'm just saying this, as you well know, I'm not an anthropologist either, so Dennis, you're not the only one, but I would like to get some feedback on all that, because it's something I've been thinking about, you know, because, you know, there was a time, like 3 months ago, I was thinking this COVID is going maybe to reshape the world, and maybe people will get to know their priorities better and get them straight. Well, it's not the case. Actually, it's getting worse. So I would like to have some feedback on all that.
Thank you so much, Christiane. I mean, thank you, Tom and Dennis, so much. I have, you know, hopefully some next time we can talk about Second World War and Bosnia, and, you know, in relation to this landscape, it's very interesting. But to answer Christiane's, you know, or to engage with your comments, sure, no, I understand. So elderly people may speak in this way about certain kinds of kind of landscapes of their past. And of course, you know, I've experienced that with my late grandmothers, for example, and so on. But these are landscapes that very often have dramatically changed and that have been reshaped very often precisely through the kind of consumption that you mentioned, so that in a way they have been taken away. You know, they didn't continue. So very often, you know, from kind of the redesign of towns and villages in Gatsko itself, there was a huge thermal power plant, which in the 70s, the Yugoslavia sort of planned and planted on top of the place of celebrations of Saint Elijah. So the kind of the oldest place. So they just kind of created this huge power plant, thermal power plant there. So of course, all of these changes very often, you know, feature in the ways in which our elders or our elderly interlocutors speak about the past. I don't think that it's disconnected or that it undermines in any way. I said that it was an idealized kind of past because it was kind of picked and chosen. There was nothing wrong in that past. But in that sense, it also seemed very political. Because, you know, as this kind of imagined, you know, idealized past, it was juxtaposed to the present, which was, you know, then, you know, completely wrong. Now, if we think about the COVID desire for consumption, as you say, it's simply kind of a different form of economy, and it's this kind of mad capitalism that we all live in. And so what it tells us is that these forms of economies construct or filter social relations. And whether it's coffee in Starbucks or, I don't know, another example of that consumption, walking together in some big supermarket in Bangkok, or whether it's an exchange of a pie for eggs or eggs for some repaired shoes in the field of Gatsko, which is this kind of economy that Muslims and Gurbeti Roma had. So they would exchange things like that. But they would, through this form of economy, form relations, not simply person to person, but sort of community to community, in the sense that there were these communal identities as well, or village to village. And so there was a structure, an economic structure to those relations as well. Or even the work in that huge thermal power plant in Gatsko, it created, because people were working together all the time, they spoke about the different traditions in their little hamlets. It featured into what later on, you know, was described as this kind of social life of the past. Because of course now it's very homogenized in workplaces. So I think, sure, consumption is you know, makes it different in terms of what we long for, but it's not simply that we long for kind of going to the supermarket or but because we can buy from Amazon. I'm not going to admit that I do, but there is something else. There's some form of social relation that develops together with that capitalist economy, I would say. I mean, that's just my thoughts.
That's pretty big, and I think we all have ideas on this question. But we have some other questions as well. So we'll hear from some other voices now, and I think we can comment and think about those on our own. And Christiane, certainly, if people want to, they can write these down, and I think send these as well, because that is the question of the moment. Luke, joining us.
I see in the chat that there's some other people who had questions or comments more related to what Christiane brought up, so I wonder if maybe they ought to.
Okay, great. Yeah, Lisa then has a question. Thank you, Luke. Lisa has a question related to that, and then Laura has a comment as well.
Lisa, are you there?
Yeah, so it's my turn. Yeah, I was wondering about the next generations of such returnees. How do they perceive the land of their ancestors? Is it homely, unhomely? Can you let me know about this?
Absolutely. Should I just answer straight away, Jeff? So that's a, thank you so much for that question, because it actually gives me a chance to engage with something that Dennis mentioned. I used in this work and in the book, Waiting for Elijah, and very much recognize the value of this kind of theory of post-memory developed by Marianne Hirsch, and some of you may know it, but she wrote it in relation to the Holocaust and how memories are sort of translated through generations, and particularly the generation which did not sort of eyewitness the concentration camps or some of the things that happened in the Second World War, but because their parents did, they lived in such an environment where those memories of their parents were translated so effectively through sighs in the middle of the night, through kind of photographs that were described in such detail, or kind of memories that were narrated so powerfully, that they feel these situations as their own memory, as something that their bodies experienced. And when I meant, now there are no second or third generation returnees, but there are people who come back for a day or maybe a couple of days, usually for St. Elijah Day. And the way that they describe this place is very often sort of an embodied landscape through the narratives of those who are older. So, for example, Edo, who you saw in one of the last images pointing at the landscape, he's one of, well, he's the only person, younger person. There's another child who was born in the returnee community, but he's the only younger person there. And he lives in Mostar, studies in Mostar, but he comes back to visit his grandparents. He knows, even though most of his life he didn't spend in this landscape, and most of his year he doesn't spend in the landscape, he knows all the herbs, he knows all the paths, he knows all the narratives of, whether it's related to cosmology or that snow that fell in 1976 in Gatsko in the summer, and so on. So he embodies sort of this landscape as if he spent his whole life there. This herb will poison you, but this will heal you, and so on. So it's this kind of very similar, at least it seems to me, to the kind of post-memory that Marianne Hirsch describes. It's a landscape that can live on through narratives that are described so viscerally.
Excellent. Laura, I think you've
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks. A lovely talk. A lot to think about. So this is a very sort of half-formed idea, but also I think relates to both what Lisa and Christiane have said of, I think the term that really came to my mind a bit is also this idea of like a social landscape, and to what extent that lays and interacts with the landscape and to what extent it doesn't. A lot of the loneliness in the sense of that you were talking about, I feel like I have sort of very similar, I have some loneliness like that, but to me it's not at all connected to where I'm from. It's more connected to community and landscape that I formed when I lived away. And so it's sort of this reverse thing of I don't have that at all where I come from. I love it, but it's not the same deep-seated thing. So thinking about like what Christiane was saying about missing going for coffee, I see that as I think what you were saying of it's missing the interaction, it's missing the sort of, so I don't know, I see it as, I like this idea of something I want to keep thinking about is a landscape that is maybe divorced from the physical landscape. It's the landscape of, going for coffee or even just going to the grocery store, or being able to sit, closer than 6 feet to people in the park. But then inevitably, I think, can you ever really divorce the social from a landscape? All of these things happen in these places, and inevitably these places, even though we don't acknowledge it, are a part of that story. Had these things happened in a different city, in a different park, it would be a different story. So it's sort of something fascinating that you were talking about with this landscape and how it holds these social thing to, or the landscape itself has this loneliness because these social events aren't happening there. So sorry, that's not really a question, but headed in that direction.
No, I mean, I think it forms an excellent question, and it forms kind of an important question about the agency of non-humans and the possibility to think about, whether we are, because it sounds like a big thing. I recently spoke for another summer school about stones that can speak, or in Bosnia as well, or can be fertilize the land or have powerful properties. Can land be lonely? It seems to me a little bit like that question about whether a tree that falls in a woodland and nobody hears it, actually really falls. Or, every landscape, as soon as we say something is a landscape, it's already social. The landscape has this very particular history as a notion from the Dutch kind of Landschap and the Golden Age Dutch painting, and the way we perceive and think about landscape is still very much related to this idea of the picturesque. So something, when it's framed in a particular way, it becomes a landscape, but we might be passing through the midst of a forest, and it's not a landscape. It's maybe some random space, but a landscape is something that's sort of framed. That's how we think of it. So it's, as soon as we recognize a landscape, we're already socializing it in a particular way. Whether land can be lonely, I think, it depends on, loneliness is a desire or the absence of certain kinds of relations. And when you see these weeds that overgrow, the houses or the tombstones, or these brambles that kind of grow over the landscape, and so you can't really walk in it and so on. Those relationships are also sort of severed in that way between, kind of interaction with animals, with humans walking through and so on, because there are these obstacles. So one could make an argument that the land itself, not being attended to through this relationship, also isolates in a way. But I guess, it's always social. Every landscape, physical is social.
Excellent. Safet, you and I were talking about those vines earlier today, and one of the things that certainly relates with home and imaginations and generations is coming back to a place that you've never been before. And for a lot of us who are used to being on the road a lot, we relate to that very much, and confronting these levels of imagination and heritage and seeing if they really are our identity or if they are our imagined identity is certainly something that I think we've all had plenty of time to think about. We'll probably have a lot longer to think about than we expected, but certainly very, very important and central to this. Christiane had another comment, and then we're going to let Tom say a couple words and then wrap things up.
There was
Luke
as well.
Luke is going to talk.
Luke's got something to say. Yes, Luke has something to say.
I had a question. I found myself thinking a lot during your talk about the lusophone concept of saudade or saudade in Brazil, which is translated in English usually just broadly as nostalgia, but it's such a weighty term for people in Portugal and Brazil that it's thought of as like a key component of the Brazilian or Portuguese speaking temperament. And I was wondering, knowing that Bosnia and that whole region is so linguistically diverse and rich, I was wondering if there are any kind of untranslatable or, unique ways of expressing the feelings that you're discussing in local languages that might not exist in English, or if there are elements of the lived experience there that have changed the way language is used to express it. And then another like aspect of the Portuguese and Brazilian connection would be the degree to which it's infiltrated the arts and specifically the music of Portugal and Brazil, and that like whole feeling of sentimentality, nostalgia, etc., is really a defining characteristic of especially fado music in Portugal, but many different kinds of music in Brazil. And I wonder, this also gets into a generational question, if, artistic output in Bosnia or among, Roma communities or other communities there have been affected by these feelings, how much of that is generational, if the younger generation kind of like identifies with it as much as the older generation. And yeah, there's a lot there, but just wondering your thoughts on that and how it relates specifically to the Bosnian question.
Luke, thank you so much for these beautiful questions. I think, first of all, in terms of the untranslatable or incommensurable with some of the translations that I've used, there certainly is. I've engaged with some of these problems, sort of where the word used is not necessarily commensurable, and particularly because I've written about time and temporality, I was looking into words for time, and there are different words for time that are used, and they're differently used, differently expressed. And even if you look sort of into the Greek language and how kind of lots of these concepts that we use and translate derive from Greek or Latin and so on. But even in Greek, there's a difference between chronos and kairos. And so in the ways in which in southeastern Bosnian people used, for example, the word vakat, which comes from Arabic, waqt, and people who speak Arabic can correct me on the pronunciation, but the way in which it's used in southeastern Bosnia is for an opportune time or a specific time for something. So they would say it's vakat for something. Oh, now is the wakat, we have to go, I don't know, go reconstruct the mosque in the morning or something. And whereas sort of vrieme, which is a more general and I think Slavic derived word for time, was used when you think about this time as a long tunnel or kind of a never-ending line or whatnot. So that's one example, but there are many. So I think for landscape, because landscape is a very particular word, there was the word kraj, which literally means kind of a bounded area or an area with a specific identity. And it's not the same as landscape because landscape has its own histories and so on. In terms of then saudade and fado, there is, I think, relatively famously sort of this Bosnian traditional music, which is called sevdah. And again, it's from an Arabic word, but which it's, if I remember correctly, comes from something for black bile or black death, something like that. And it's about sadness experienced because of love lost. And most of these are love songs. They're traditional, but they're heavily influenced by Jewish Sephardic music from the Iberian Peninsula. And when Sephardic Jewish people sort of moved to these areas after being forced away from the Iberian Peninsula. And then now it's very much commercialized, but they're also epic songs, which I think are so much more interesting in these landscapes. Two people from Harvard who are the foremost authorities on who were the foremost authorities on epics, ancient Greek epics, Albert Lord and Milman Perry. They formed a theory called oral formulaic theory based on research in Gatsko and this area. And they found a person who recounted an epic song as long as the Iliad, without any help, without any sort of mnemonic. Well, there were, of course, mnemonic devices, but no text in front of them. And this was, as long as the Iliad. So it's a very famous, I think, at least in literary circles and in these linguistic circles, it's a very famous area for that. Thanks.
Wonderful. Just one second. We have a question coming in here. Protracted says, is the idea of nation state in its current form very intrusive to a more primary group we call home, and it transcends over time? Safet, can you read that as well?
Yes, I'm reading it right now. Perhaps, okay, so it's the nation state is intrusive. I think that's the whole point, and you know, maybe I even overemphasize that. That the nation state, more than any other thing, and you know, it was the same question in the Second World War when there was ethnic cleansing, and you know, basically all of the Jewish people in Bosnia were murdered. There's this very small community that survived, and you know, lives about 1,000 people in Bosnia today, descendants of those people who survived. But so there was a question of nationalism, and this 1990s war was a question of nationalism, and it's a destruction of, you don't even have to call it home, it's just habitat, of landscapes, of houses, of, you know, connections, of temples, of libraries, you know, which Tom is, I know, is now interested in making these connections between the destruction of libraries in Bosnia and in Lebanon. But it's constant destruction. And of course, you know, as part of that destruction, also destruction of anything that's considered homely. Does it transcend over time? I just feel it has always been there, but there are times when it's... no, but exactly, it's about these moments of disorientation. At some moments, you know, people really, I think, almost forgot this kind of violence that swept through Bosnia and through Yugoslavia in the Second World War. And by the late 80s, with this resurrection of nationalism, nobody believed it can happen. You know, I even remember this from my childhood. Nobody said, no, there won't be war, of course, that cannot happen and whatnot. So there are certain times, and there's kind of this, you know, people are forced into a sudden realization that violence is always lurking around the corner with violent programs, and they always latch upon, you know, language, religion, ethnicity, and so on. And yeah, so that's sort of probably a very small part of an answer, but thanks for your question.
Safet, you have one more question coming in from Fiona. Fiona, it's really nice to hear from you. And then after this question, we're going to close it down with a couple of remarks because our time is coming to an end today. So I don't know if you can read this to everybody just who's watching during the recording. Hi, Safet. Sorry, I can't speak through the mic because Shanghai, it's midnight and all my roommates are asleep. It's now actually 1:30 in Shanghai, I think. Well, it was midnight when we started, right? How can we understand the impossibility of returnees? Maybe there are some people who don't even have the chance of returning because maybe the loneliness we're experiencing is also a form of fear of uncertainty. Wow.
No, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for coming to join us, even though it's midnight and past midnight now. It's such a pleasure, and then, you know, it's so lovely to have you. You know, we haven't spoken to each other in quite some time, in a year's time. No, absolutely. It's exactly the reason why people are not returning, and the reason why I know is because I also spoke to people in, you know, some diasporas, or people who are still in exile, or, you know, most of them have continued their lives, and, you know, they have to. But when you speak about, you know, the possibility of return, it's always that, you know, it's there are no people there. And people who have returned, they understand. So there's no sort of anger towards those in the diaspora who are not returning. You know, Bachir and Zahida, that elderly couple that I showed you, they spoke about their grandson not returning, and they said, well, if there was you here, at least, if there were 20 of you, the people your age here, then maybe, but how can he return? But then they look around because we're sitting on their outside in the garden, and they look at the landscape and they say, but can you see how beautiful this landscape is? So they have this kind of constant struggle between that understanding that it's impossible and that desire to continue a certain life there. But no, most of the people find that uncertainty and loneliness and isolation are too much, and that simply life has to continue elsewhere. It's a lovely question. Thank you.
And a lovely answer. We're nearing the end of our time. I think that in this series, one thing's for certain is that all of these sessions could go on forever, which is the wonder of this field and everybody who's participating today. It feels very comfortable to be having these discussions in this environment. And again, yes, thank you for everyone that joined from all over. What I would say is if you have any additional questions, please feel free to type those out and send them to me by email with the email that you registered for the event on, because that will continue to stimulate and inform us. And at some point, Safet will certainly be able to collect these questions, and maybe from those questions, another theme will come out. Thank you so much, Safet, for spending your time today. You're on your way in transit to do some more field work, so we're crossing our fingers that that works out for you. And it is certainly evening in Taormina, so that brings our total of people from Italy to 2 today. Giada, you can probably wave down over to Sicily from you, which is good. This session, this series will continue every third Thursday of the month. We are working on our permanent schedule, or our schedule now. We have had an exceptionally large number of idea submissions and requests, and so we'll be processing those and sending an update to you. I'll try not to spam you, or I won't spam you. Eventbrite may, but I won't. We will be in touch shortly about our next series, and certainly talk to you about the conference that will be in January or February. What I would like to say is that as we are talking about home and hospitality, this space is one that I hope you all feel is safe, and is one that inspires you, regardless of your involvement in this field or anything. If we didn't get to your questions today, it's just a matter of time, and unfortunately, but we will get to those next time. So on that closing, I'd like to thank you all for participating in this today and believing in what we're trying to do. This is something that we've discussed for years. And in this unfortunate situation of not being together, there blossoms an opportunity for us to connect in ways with each other that we wouldn't have thought of or imagined years ago. So with that, thank you very much again, Safet, and thank you, Tom, and thank you all individually for
organizing all of this.
And we'll be in touch down the road. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye-bye.